Hey guys, it's your old pal John. I hope you're all doing well. Today we're looking at why do the British look down on Americans, and boy, don't I have a lot of reasons why they would at this point. But let's get into it.
I always feel really terrible
Okay.
that everyone's first attitude is, "Oh, you're from America, are you?" Oh, okay. Which is always a bit. You always feel a bit bad about that because I'm not entirely sure why we still do that. But it's,
How do you feel perceived as Americans by the British here in London?
A big, stupid, bellowing oaf.
What?
Yeah, genuinely. I always feel like I have to apologize for being Americans. Like, I know my accent's the worst thing you'll hear today, but can I just order a coffee?
My experience, I feel like, has been a little bit different. I think that might be
Interesting.
somewhat informed by the fact that I'm a student here. At first, there was a bit of a learning curve. Like, when I would speak loudly on the tube, I would kind of get looks, and people would tell me, like, you're being American, like, can you maybe not?
There's definitely sort of a sense that there is a lot of difficult things going on
Yeah.
in America, and that America potentially could
Yeah.
be quite a
Very
difficult
true.
place to live, especially if you're of colour
Oh,
or
yeah.
from the Middle East.
I
Yep.
have to admit, the inspiration to make this video came when I moved to
Right.
Europe. As I
It's interesting that this is being done by an American. So I hope they get honest answers. Maybe they won't be as as vocal as they might want to be, but I'm sure it's very good. But bottom line, there's a lot that you can say about why people look down on Americans, and yeah, we do feel like we have the need to apologize for a lot of things. It is true. At least the ones who are, at least a lot of Americans who travel or have more of a global outlook.
I've explored in previous videos on this channel. Many Europeans have mixed to negative views of Americans as dumb and uncultured. But to my surprise, the same goes for the British. I've come to realize that the only people that see the British as intelligent and sophisticated are the Americans.
Really?
Many Europeans, like the Portuguese or the Spanish, see a very different reality. The British that go off on holiday to get extremely drunk and break things. The British that are isolationist with Brexit. The British that don't learn foreign languages, that stick to their native tongue. Wait a second, I thought to myself. That's what Americans do. Other people do this as well?
How dare they copy us?
I kid, of course. Still,
Yeah.
it does feel like the Brits act like the Americans of Europe. But I am certain that is not something that they'd like to hear.
The Brits act like the Americans of Europe. Wow, that's pretty harsh. Sorry.
Said about them. I mean, no offense. I am American after all. Does that not prove my point though? No one wants to stoop to the level of Americans. I felt I had to get my answers directly from the source. My perception is that the UK is 1 foot in Europe, 1 foot like in the Americas. It feels like it should be in the middle of the Atlantic. Do you agree with that?
I think that's a pretty conclusive idea.
Really?
I think that's definitely
Okay.
true because a lot of people wouldn't even class England as being in Europe. Even in England, when you talk about going to Europe, no one ever thinks you mean Doncaster. They always think you mean Germany. You do get some perception
Okay.
that everyone's some sort of like a Valley girl accent or something like that, and I think that annoys people quite a lot. But
That's
then
kind
again,
of
it's
an
the same way
older
that English people are often perceived as all sort of being from London. You got the American dream, making yourself better and being seen to be self-improving, and it's a lot about earning money and being the best you can and going to the gym and all these kind of things. Whereas
are you saying it's positive or negative?
I think it's a positive thing for Americans, but I think the way it's perceived is often everyone goes, "Oh, get out of my face," because no one likes to enjoy someone else's success, at least in England anyway. I think
It's actually a really good point. Up until I would say like around maybe like the 80s, there were a lot of people who would promote doing well, and yeah, I mean, if you do well, it upsets other people. I mean, there are very few people who say, "Oh, you've done well, congratulations." I mean, I'm probably one of the few people who congratulate people when they get successful. I know there's some people out there. I think you can cast your own lot in life, and there isn't as much of a class difference nowadays. I think there is actually, but when I was growing up, there definitely wasn't that much. I mean, there were certainly obviously extreme differences to a certain extent, but not at the moment. Sure, I'm just taking back that part that says not at the moment. At the moment, definitely.
I think in America it's probably very different. Oh, great, you got a promotion, fucking bastards! I think
The identity
Really?
of being American is like such a thing
Huh.
Right.
that I don't think
other places have that as much.
I don't think people are necessarily dumb, and I don't think it's a question of being dumb. I think it's just that there's this idea of like, yeah, being the best. To think that like people in America, depending on where you're born, you can have access to care or not, it's frightening. And I don't know how you can speak about being the best when you can't even make sure that everybody's like taken care of. Are you treating everyone the same way in America? No, not everyone is treated the same way, just like not everyone is treated the same way in Europe.
Just a quick thing, the whole dumb thing, that actually has to do with where in America you come from. I mean, if you see the videos where people, and I think I've done one in the past or two, where it's like, they can't answer like simple questions. That has to do with the more poor areas and the less educated areas in the United States. Think of the United States a little bit more as like it's not necessarily a country. It's like a bunch of countries is really what it comes down to. Might be a way to look at it, but yeah, we're definitely not the best. We tried up until like the 1950s pretty hard to do the best we could, but that attitude slowly started to slip away when everyone else became more free and also began changing, and they surpassed us, and yet we're still holding on to this 60-year-old idea that we're free, we're the best, we're whatever. No, we certainly at our point in history certainly led the way for some things, but a lot of people can't grasp that this time has passed, and we have to move on because, as our Civil War pointed out, everybody's supposed to be created equally, so that refers to everybody.
Having been to America a lot, they often ask, obviously as a joke, but just like, do you know the royal family or anything like that?
So do you feel that generally, this big generalization, there's mockery towards the Americans and Americans towards the British is more like cute, we think you're cute?
Yeah, I would say that, yeah.
How do you feel about Americans thinking you're cute?
Well, it can be taken as a compliment, obviously, but if they think that we're, like, as a country, not really a force to be reckoned with, then just because we do all these, like, things that date back to long before the US was established, it's not really relevant that they can mock us for that.
Is it condescending, would you say?
A little bit.
Or ignorant?
More ignorant.
Yeah,
it's
ignorant.
Not, it doesn't, like, hurt me.
How do you feel Americans perceive the British, first of all?
They kind of look down on us.
You feel that?
I feel like Americans think like they're on top of everything, and there's always competition between
they
the
act
two.
that way.
So do you feel like the British have a chip on their shoulder a little bit because of that?
Yeah, a lot.
What do you think the British are better at than Americans?
Being polite, really.
More polite?
Yeah, more talkative, more helpful.
More helpful, the British are more helpful?
Yeah, than Americans. But Americans are nice, they're funny, got good music.
Okay.
I would just say that when it comes to the world stage, I think we're both pretty helpful in terms of countries. I think the difference is that the United States sort of has a hidden agenda. It's always we're doing something that we perceive as nice and everyone, helpful, but it has to do with it's going to come back and help the United States. Like it's in our best interest. I think Britain tends to do things that are more right than not necessarily for the good of Great Britain. Although, there are those things too, absolutely. But that's what when I look at Britain, I think of, sometimes there are a lot of selfless acts that they do, and not so much in America.
Good music, okay. Well, the British have good music too, man.
Americans are taking over the music scene.
But come on, there's a lot of great British music. So here's the
thing
that I think is going on here. We are not the same, the Brits and the Americans, but we sure have a lot of similarities. Compare us to the Japanese, or to Native Americans, or to Ethiopians, and the differences between Americans and the British seems relatively small. We're like blood siblings in the village that is the globe. So here's what all of this started to make me think of. There's a concept in psychoanalysis, I'm going to read you the definition, but it's called the narcissism of small differences. This comes from Freud. The narcissism of small differences is the idea that the more a relationship or community shares commonalities, the more likely the people in it are to engage in interpersonal feuds and mutual ridicule because of hypersensitivity to minor differences perceived in each other. We see this all over the world, between the Argentinians and the Chileans, for example, between the French and the Belgians. And indeed, I think this is what is happening between the Brits and the Americans. But at the end of the day, I feel like we make the little things that make us different much bigger than they really are.
The way that we speak and the words that we use.
Yeah.
And again, we were talking about this, weren't we?
Yeah.
About
we were
certain
talking
words.
about things like autumn versus fall. And
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
that's often something that people like bring up. And for some, well, it's because it's a simpler word. And it's like, fall, American.
You guys don't
that's
say
it.
fall?
No, we don't.
No,
We
no.
say
Oh,
autumn.
interesting. Okay.
So this is autumn, not fall.
But you can say autumn as well. All right.
It sounds better too.
I want to quickly thank the sponsor of this video,
Oop.
BetterHelp, who's
Okay, that was BetterHelp. They're pretty good at whatever they help. And we are hopefully back.
Let's dive back in. Personally, when I come to the UK, I have the impression that I've come halfway across the Atlantic. I'm not just off the coast of continental Europe. And by that I mean, culturally, it feels so much more similar to the life that I had in the US. The convenience of life, the speed, the capitalism, the language.
Everyone
Okay.
speaks English.
Yeah.
Everyone's like got the same sort of core values. I'm not necessarily a big Christian person at all, but we all come from this like Christian-based countries. America and Australia are English. There's some things that happen in history, but at the end of the day, we're kind of all the same group of people in that regard.
Culturally influenced.
Culturally influenced by the same group. So I personally don't see many differences at all.
I mean, I've got wonderful
Interesting.
American friends who I adore. So that question for me is a difficult one because I
course.
think they're great, they're fantastic. I think the differences in the way our language is, in the way we use different words, that's where there's a difference.
So
But
pretty minor.
Yeah.
Do you think that sometimes some of the British media or the portion of the British population that looks down on Americans, is it a way to deflect some of the issues that exist here? Could that be said of all societies?
Yeah, you can say that of all societies,
That's
but
fair.
you can also say that about the media. They're always distracting, aren't they, from
yeah.
topics, whatever it is.
That is true because, I mean, you just look at any of our mainstream media and they just, they throw their own narrative and sometimes it's a weird one. And the rest of the world or whomever wants to watch it or see it, they get that idea that that's America.
It's very alpha male. If you
It's
think
not.
about it in terms of masculine and feminine.
Yeah.
There's an alpha maleness to Americans. And maybe it's just the way they speak, the accent, but you don't really have that sense of Britain. I think there's a stereotype of the repressed male, that soft-spoken.
Considering we're like right on the edge of Europe, we have more in common with America in many ways than we do with the rest of Europe, which in theory is where we should be more aligned. And I think there's sort of something that can feel sort of slightly odd about that, you know, like with the whole Brexit thing, breaking away more from where we're most closely connected to and sort of being in a situation where, you know, we're going to end up with chlorinated chicken.
There's this tendency to think of Americans as just, you know, they're simplistic, really.
Are you like annoyed by the Americans here in
Sometimes.
I wouldn't say
Depends how they are.
I like that she's
Now
honest.
the interesting
really
thing is
honest.
I love to drag the US through the mud and criticize it for all the things that I think it deserves criticism for, but the second the Brits start criticizing me or the US, you have nothing to say. Kind of like I can criticize where I grew up, but you aren't allowed to. And the British, in my opinion, are doing their version of the same thing, criticizing themselves to no end, but no one wants an outside opinion. Maybe we all do this. I think we all do
fair.
this. It's like pointing at someone else's flooding house when your own house is on fire.
So I lived in America for 6 years. I lived in California, Alabama, and Oklahoma for 3 years.
Alabama,
Everyone
oh
hears
boy.
my accent.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, where in America are you from? I'm like, bro, I'm actually from Australia, but then
Wow.
they give me their little opinions on American stuff. So I've actually had to play defense a couple times since I've been out here.
Are you serious?
I'm so serious. Because they talk about guns or they talk about this, but they don't have like a very good understanding, not just English people, this is people around the world, even in Australia, of the history of America and why those things became what they were. People trying to
That's extremely fair. We have a very weird, not weird history, but to know where you're at, you have to know where you've come from. And so making the generalizations about the United States, if you don't know the history, you don't know how we get here. Because, you know, once you trace the history of of Britain or like Britain, for example, you begin to understand why, you know, modern day Britain is the way it is. And it's the same with the United States.
throw rocks and then hide their hands.
Yeah.
They don't want the blame to be on them, so it's easy to put it on the big superpower that is on everyone's TV.
My perception is I don't consider Americans necessarily lesser in terms of like lifestyle, culture per se. I just think it's a bit more apparent than it is in the UK, but the UK is just as problematic.
There's always sort of a sense in the past that like America was sort of, 2 decades ahead of what was happening in this country. There is a sense that we're getting closer in a time frame.
I would say younger generations tend to be a bit more, and the only word I can think of it is shameful of the heritage. I think it's a lot of things from like colonialization and things like that. There tends to be a lot more shame around it.
We're a small island, right?
Oh, I'm pretty sure that we all have our hand in, well, we call it colonization, but colonialization, I guess that would be the right word, yeah. We've done it too. We've had our moments of imperialism all the way up to the 20th century, mid-20th century and further.
Right, so we've got a small island mentality, but because we've got a small island mentality, we've got to overcome it by kind of that impression that we're the best. And I think that's changing, though. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a total reflection of society now, but I think historically it has been, of course. Let's flip the question. How are Americans perceiving the British?
My answer to that is there is a power dynamic going on, and for better or for worse, the U.S. is much more of a world superpower right now. So I don't think that the U.S. feels threatened necessarily, like competitive with Great Britain. Because of that, I think there's kind of like they're cute, you know what I mean? Like they're Harry Potter and James Bond and sophisticated and
Use words like autumn.
Exactly. But I also think that there's also a major degree of ignorance. Like the U.S. is so self-involved. We're not even paying attention to what's going on elsewhere in the world. So there's not even enough to form an opinion. Now this.
I want to just point out on this. I think anybody who is, I would say, somewhat educated, or maybe somebody who went to like a university, we would tend to look at Britain as, yes, smaller in terms of population and size. However, it's sort of like looking at it as if there's the army versus the special forces. I always thought that Britain, and I kind of still do, think that everything that Britain tends to do, they do it better, albeit on a smaller scale than the U.S. And I could be wrong about that, but that's the feeling I get. I don't have anything to back it up, though, at the moment.
This video was definitely supposed to be in good fun. I harbor no ill will towards the British. I find our rivalries as human beings across cultures, across nations, to be comical and interesting. It's like an insight into human psychology. And despite all of the, criticizing going on here, I'd like to end on a positive note. I'd like to express my appreciation for a few things that I think the British do better than Americans. Your healthcare system, for one. Also, the Premier League. They say football was invented in England, and if that is true, as someone with Argentinian background, I can only thank you. I also have to thank you for your incredible music. What a contribution
I agree.
to our collective heritage. It is a foreign idea to me to have a royal family, but I respect the commitment to tradition.
I did move here the week that the Queen died, so it was really interesting to see. I think my first impression of like the British as a public was that of like mourning for their queen, the 14-hour-long line to go see her lying in state. So I think it was a little bit of a shock. This might sound silly, but how procedural the British can be. I noticed that tends to be, like every British person I've met, tends to be very procedural. As opposed to Americans, I think are a little bit more, like, dare I say, free-spirited or individualistic.
Oh, that's
so,
true.
I think that's not to say that one is better than the other.
We're so individualistic that God knows this is this kind of stuff that you see when you look online. It says, like, dumb American. They've got their own ideas of what they're going to do, and screw anyone that gets in their way. Freedom, that kind of thing.
Final note, we are obviously a world of individuals, and so stereotypes never fully work. Still, I find it so fascinating to explore the stereotypes and cliches that we have for one another. Not always, but often there is some sort of basis of truth there, or else.
All right, I'm going to let this guy go right here, but what do you think about this? I thought this was probably the most insightful video that I've seen on this one or interview. Let me know what y'all think in the comments. I'll talk to you soon. Have a great one.